Welcome back. Next up is a lesson covering the security standards and protocol that are leveraged within vSphere. This lesson will cover the secure vCenter server with TLS 1.2, and this also covers the FIPS 140-2 standard, which is used in both ESX servers and vCenter servers. Now, these protocols are basically the standards, and in fact, for the case of 1.2, this is the standard that is used. You should never turn this off, but there are mechanisms in managing this, and the same goes with the FIPS 140-2 standard. You do not want to turn these off, but these are what the system uses for a variety of security enhancements. So first of all, TLS, Transport Layer Security. This is basically the successor to SSL, right? There's been different versions of SSL over the years, SSL 1, 2, and 3. Each one, of course, had vulnerabilities, and then the replacement for SSL became the Transport Layer Security. And so there's version 1, 1.1, 1.2. And so after the issues within 1.0 and 1.1, effectively in vSphere these days, 1.2 is the only standard that is, or the only version that is enabled. Now, that's actually been the case since vSphere 6.7 and later. In older versions, in 6.5, for instance, TLS 1.0 and 1.1 and 1.2 were all available, and it has been recommended from those who are using 6.5, you should go in and disable 1.0 and 1.1. The mechanism for doing that, by the way, actually is by downloading a utility that you can find in a knowledge base article on why is 1.2 the recommended version of TLS that you should run in any vSphere environment. You can download the utility on a 6.5 vCenter system to then adjust which versions of TLS are going to be enabled in the environment. In 6.7, that utility is now built in. So you can leverage that utility. It's basically called the TLS configurator utility, so that you could enable the TLS versions 1.0 and 1.1 if you had to. Why would you ever have to? Well, if you are actually working with a product, a third-party product that needs to communicate with vSphere in some way, and that third-party product is going to only be able to leverage 1.0 or 1.1, right? It would be strongly encouraged to find out if there's an update to that product to see if the update supports 1.2. But if it isn't, and there is no other option, then, and you had to use that third-party product, then you can, in your vSphere environment, enable the different versions of TLS. But the standard is, and the recommendation quite strongly, to use TLS 1.2. Another standard that vSphere is compliant with is the Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS, and this happens to be FIPS 140-2. And basically, this is a government standard actually established by both the US and Canadian governments, where that any kind of cryptographic modules that are used in vSphere must be compliant with these standards, right? With the FIPS 140-2 standard. And so the cryptographic modules in vSphere are always going to be using the FIPS standards. In fact, by default, this has been the case since the vSphere 6.7 release, so it's from 6.7 and onwards, cryptographic operations will be FIPS 140-2 compliant, right? In fact, during the installation of ESXi, the FIPS 140-2 validates the crypto processors have been installed and that the FIPS 140-2 mode is currently enabled. When it's enabled, basically, here's what the functionality you get. Basically, vSphere will use the VMware cryptographic module, a library that provides the FIPS 140-2 approved cryptographic services, and the vSphere will use only cryptographic modules that are compliant with the standard. So when does this actually get used? Well, for any types of connections over HTTPS, SSH, for both connecting to an ESXi host, as well as connecting to the vCenter server, those are going to use a FIPS certified cryptographic module. For anything else, the ESX server's VM kernel will always use what's called the VMK crypto module for providing any kind of cryptographic operations elsewhere within the VM kernel. And then when it comes to the vCenter certificate authority, which generates private keys and such, the VMCA will also use a FIPS 140-2 compliant cryptographic module. So they're already there, they're already enabled, And you generally don't need to change this unless whatever system that you're communicating with can't be compliant with this would be the only reason for doing this. But then this would not be recommended, because to be, with a, to be compliant with that FIPS standard, you would need to have these crypto modules enabled. But you can actually manage them from the command line. On the ESXi host, you can enable or disable the FIPS 140-2 mode from the ESXCLI command itself. ESXCLI, using the system namespace under the security subnamespace and the FIPS 140 namespace, dive into either SSH or our HTTP proxy to find what the current mode you're running in and set to potentially change the mode. And so you'll see you can actually independently change the SSH as well as the RHTTP proxy. They don't have to be set in unison. They can be set independently from each other. Same actually with the vCenter appliance too. On the vCenter server command line, you'll have to navigate to the userlib VMware FIPS folder, and then you're going to be running the FIPS control command. The FIPS control command, run it with the status argument to find out what the current status. As you see in our example, the FIPS control status command is showing that all three of the things that it is responsible for, the RHTTP proxy, the SSHD daemon, and the VMCA, they're all enabled. But then you can pick and choose, if you needed to, disable the FIPS compliant version of the different services, whether it's the RHTTP proxy or SSHD or VMCA. You can run the FIPS control disable and then provide the service that you would like to disable this compliancy with. And then, of course, the enable command to enable them once again. But by all means, the recommendation is to leave this with FIPS 140-2 standard enabled, and also make sure that your server is only using TLS 1.2. It's always going to be using TLS 1.2, but make sure the older versions of TLS are disabled, which they are already by default. So just to kind of match these as different descriptions here, what we were just mentioning, we actually were mentioning just two things, but just as a bit of a review for something we had covered earlier in the class. Which of the following on this matching game is a government standard that specifies security requirements for cryptographic modules? Well, we actually just were mentioning that. For the cryptographic modules, that is the FIPS 140-2 standard. Now, what about the next one? Industry-wide standard for secure crypto processors. Now, we didn't actually cover that in this lesson, but we did cover this quite some time ago when we were covering the whole vSphere Trust Authority, right? Where that is dependent on a piece of hardware set on your motherboard, which is what we call the TPM chip, right? The Trusted Platform Module. That contains the crypto processors for then generating the cryptographic keys and the signatures required to provide for remote attestation by vCenter when a host is being booted into secure boot. Finally, there is the cryptographic protocol that provides secure communications over any transport, right? With a name like that, transport, transport layer security. Well, actually, that was the only thing that was left in our list, right? So by process of elimination, we know that's TLS. So we took a quick look at the process of understanding how vCenter is secured with TLS 1.2, and also how we can enable or even disable the FIPS 140-2 standard for both ESXi hosts and vCenter instances. So that ends this lesson. We'll take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll see you in the next lesson.